The Shadow of a Nightmare by Donald Wandre. I have never read, remarked Arthur Merrill, a true horror story. We who were with him in a corner of the clubhouse looked at him in surprise.
Why, you've been making a study of Gothic literature for 20 years or more. You surely must have read some,
a member replied.
Of course. Then why did you say you hadn't?
I didn't. We looked at him puzzled.
For heaven's sake, will you kindly explain yourself?
Someone demanded. The thing is obvious, or ought to be. I said I had read no true horror story, though I have read many which seem so for a moment.
What's the difference?
This. The best stories of the type called Gothic may affect a person temporarily. Some may even give him nightmares if he is of a nervous temperament. But this does not necessarily mean that they are true horror tales.
It depends on what you mean by a horror story,
someone remarked. Exactly. And can you tell me what a tale of horror is?
One that makes your spine crawl?
One that, if you read at night while alone, will make you jump for bed. One that will make you afraid of the night.
One that you can't recall except with a shiver. One that you won't want to recall.
Arthur quelled the babble.
You are all partly right. What's your own definition?
Asked somebody. He thought for a moment. Then he replied, What I will say will apply only to those who have more than a passing acquaintance with Gothic literature. One who reads but little and has never come across more than one or two specimens of the macabre will naturally have received a much deeper impression from those stories than would one who is familiar with the type. The more tales of terror you read, the more inured you become. There is always the thrill of the first few horror stories, of course, but indifference comes quickly. Life is so comprehensive that little can be new. But the unknown, the utterly unknown, is the essence of terror. I have made a study of this field for 20 years or so. My collection of such books and manuscripts, as you know, is one of the best, perhaps the only ambitious one in existence. A taste for the gruesome, once acquired, is unappeasable, but although my library contains thousands of these volumes, there is not one among them which I consider a true Gothic romance. A tale of horror is one which begins on a low key of foreboding, and rises steadily and rapidly like the howl of a wolf, until words of awful imagery twist across the dead pages in a stream of terror. A tale that begins in shadow and passes into darkness, until an utter blackness filled with things surges about the reader. A tale that preys on the mind, that destroys all but one central part and wraps itself around that part on which to feed. As I said, there is no such story in all my collection. I have obtained many books famed as being horrible, but they all lack something, or at best have only a temporary effect. The monk in reality does not belong to the class. Melmoth is more properly an adventure novel. The vampire is as good as its progeny Dracula, but vampires are becoming common. Frankenstein is famous mainly because it was one of the first Gothic romances. Benson is often too definite. Poe is the master, of course, though Lovecraft is now writing terrific tales. You see, if an author makes his story too definite, it descends to the ordinary, or becomes either disgusting or ridiculous, depending on how far he goes. Thus, Wells' The Cone is disgusting, as are tales of cannibalism and torture. Physical pain is ephemeral. It comes to an end. The mind cannot be greatly affected by finite or material things, because it is acquainted with them. It needs a tale of hints and whispers that it can develop unlimitedly. We were silent for a moment, but someone broke out.
Do you expect ever to read such a story?
Perhaps, was his only reply. 2. I believe it was 2 days later that Arthur took me into his confidence. He did not mention the tale to anyone else, but he told me about it because I myself was quite fond of Gothic literature. There is now on its way to me a manuscript from an agent in India, he said. It was purchased from a native who had stolen it from a collection of ancient writings somewhere in the north. Exactly where, I don't know. My agent could make little of it, but the native claimed that it had been passed into evil legend. I found a reference to the manuscript in a Sanskrit fragment over 3,000 years old. Even there, it is described as being of unknown age. "Think of it," he half whispered to me. "It was written perhaps 100 or more centuries ago. I believe from the translation of the Sanskrit fragment that it will be the key to the forgotten past. For ages ago, the fragment states, there arose somewhere in the northern part of India, or beyond the Himalayas, a civilization of the highest type, among a band of people completely isolated from the rest of their kind. But they all were madmen, maniacs. They were countless centuries ahead of their time, but they were insane. They lived in the days when the world was still young, and they had access to forces which have passed with the waning of the earth. And because they were mad, they had those forces more readily at their control." His eyes were gleaming brighter. "They developed an advanced, but a mad and perverted civilization, with the aid of those evil forces. Their architecture was strange and fantastic. Their art was a thing of shadows, the reflection of their madness and their servants. Their literature was the key to all ancient mysteries, the portal to the entities which have remained hidden for epochs, and are now remembered only as myths, legends, and fabled lore. They had at their call terrific implements of power and destruction in those evil ones. They kept that secret in their literature. But with the coming of a now unknown doom, the entire country was ravaged. The cities became heaps of dust. The inhabitants were wiped out, and all their work was obliterated, except one small group of books. And of that group, the only manuscript extant is the one I shall receive, written by a madman whose every thought was inspired by the ravening things inseparably connected with the country of the mad, and giving somewhere in it the key to what the world has forgotten." I was inflamed, of course, by this extraordinary narrative, and eager to know more. A torrent of questions burst from me, but Arthur had told me all he knew. He suggested that I come over, however, when the manuscript had arrived. I did not see him in the meantime, but when he notified me a couple of weeks later that he had received the manuscript, I immediately hastened over. Never before had I seen him so excited. His eyes shone and gleamed steadily. He was nervous, and not only were his old mannerisms intensified, but he had picked up a dozen new ones. His voice had an unusual tone, an unsteadiness. "Come in. The manuscript's here." I followed him inside, and we walked to the rooms containing his library. A large table covered with books stood in the middle of one room. He motioned me toward it. All the volumes were ancient and musty. Some were riddled with wormholes. Some had damp stains and mold spots, while others had faded or discolored leaves. "Here it is," he said, pointing before him. It was almost with awe that I looked at the manuscript. The leaves of it were fastened between old and worn covers of ivory that once had been inscribed with strange gold symbols. The characters within on parchment of great age were totally unfamiliar to me. Many of those near the margins had faded or had been thumbed to illegibility, but in the centers they were black and distinct. The writing was clear and in a fine hand, yet the manuscript aroused in me an immediate distaste. Something about those ancient leaves with their black unknown characters repelled me in a singular manner. "In what language is it written?" "I'm not sure," he replied slowly. "I've been comparing it with the oldest of the Indian tongues, but it doesn't agree with any of them. It resembles Sanskrit most closely, and seems to bear the relation to it that Anglo-Saxon does to modern English. Phew, it must be one of the oldest works in existence. Have you begun to decipher it yet?" "I am just commencing the task, which I may not finish for weeks. But what a find! I think I have my tale at last." 3. I did not see him again until 2 months later, for I was out of town. The manuscript was not forgotten, however. On several occasions it came into my thoughts, and I wondered how Arthur was progressing, or if it lived up to his hopes. But I heard nothing from him during the period, and it had faded somewhat into the background of memory by the time I returned. The evening after I got back, I decided to call on Arthur. I dropped in at the club on my way to his home, thinking he might possibly be there. He wasn't. But I met an old friend and we chatted for a few minutes. As I left him to continue my way, he remarked, "Sorry you're leaving so quickly. Is it a pressing engagement?" "Well, not exactly," I replied. "I'm going to see if Arthur's home." I've never seen the face of a man change as rapidly as his. For a brief instant his features altered, and there came into his face an expression of aversion, almost of fear. I looked at him in surprise. He pursed his lips as if to answer my unspoken question, but said nothing. Instead, he motioned me toward a counter. For another minute he was silent, after which we had seated ourselves, before asking, "When did you last see Arthur?" "About 2 months ago. Why?" He ignored my question and said, half to himself, "And you have known him as long as I." "Longer. But what are you driving at?" Again he ignored my question. "You will keep this to yourself?" "Of course," I answered. I was beginning to feel slightly alarmed as well as puzzled. "But what's the matter?" He seemed to be arranging his thoughts when, in a moment, he began speaking. His face was almost expressionless, and he talked in a low tone which did not go beyond me, though I could hear him distinctly. "Perhaps you can explain this. I can't, though I have spent a week on it, and I'm beginning to wonder if it will be explained. Well, I saw him a week ago, Tuesday to be exact. I had gone out to his house for the evening and intended to pass several hours there. Arthur lives alone, you know, and we would not be interrupted, but should have the evening to ourselves, since it was the servants' night off. I arrived about 7:30, and Arthur himself admitted me. One of the first things he did was to show me some recent additions to his queer library. He had acquired some Latin works on demonology. Among them a rather gruesome 16th century volume that contained several of Bruegel the Elder's nightmare compositions engraved, I think by Koch. There was also a manuscript of great age which evidently fascinated him. He handled it with a mixture of like and disdain for some minutes while we were looking at his new volumes, and seemed half reluctant, half glad to leave it. When we left the books, we went to his den, or whatever he calls the room where he keeps his curios, and it was there that I was first struck by something unusual about his appearance. I had not noticed anything different before we looked at the manuscript and the books, but I did now. There was something definitely wrong. But his eyes, you have noticed them, their sunkenness and depth, well, they were lit curiously in a frightened sort of way. And he was nervous. He had picked up a number of mannerisms, and was so restless that I thought he must be suffering from overwork, or in need of a change. At times he fell into an abstraction, or gazed steadily at some vacant spot as if he saw something. Once he jerked his head around unexpectedly as if he thought someone was behind him, and that frightened look never left his eyes. "You ought to take a vacation," I remarked suddenly. "You're wearing yourself out." "I know it," he replied. "Perhaps I will soon. I've been spending all my time translating the manuscript, and it was quite a strain, but I finished it last night, so perhaps I won't need a rest." He stopped, but almost immediately continued, as if anxious to complete his story. "It was after 10, I believe, when Arthur stood up suddenly with an apology and a remark about books that I didn't quite catch, and left the room. I amused myself glancing at some of the curios while I waited. 5 minutes passed. I turned the old guns on the wall and examined them. 10 minutes came, and I wondered at the delay. I looked at the curios another 5 minutes, then I began to feel slightly puzzled. The room was silent, and my thoughts were coursing in strange channels. I began to listen in spite of myself, but no sound could be heard. Fancies began to intrude themselves into my mind, and I became vaguely apprehensive. I could have sworn that the atmosphere of the room had changed. Then I felt oddly uncomfortable and restless. I began to imagine all kinds of things. I tried to forget them. I tried to discount them as mere imagination. I thrust them away. They kept coming back. There was absolutely no ground for fear or doubt, but I was really alarmed. Then I got angry with myself and stood still. But the silence oppressed me, and I walked about the room again. I could not imagine what was wrong with me. I pulled out my watch. Over 20 minutes had elapsed, and Arthur was still gone. "I'm an ass," I cursed myself, "but I can't stand this any longer." He said something about books. I'll glance at his library, where he must be. I left the room immediately and walked to the library, calling myself a fool as I walked. A light shone through the open door, and I stepped in. I guessed right. Arthur was standing near the middle of the room with his back half toward me. "I hope I'm not intruding," I said, "but I got restless and thought something might have happened to you." He did not reply. Then I noticed that there was something curious in his attitude. He was swaying as if about to fall. I saw him pass his arm across his forehead and eyes as I sprang to his side. As I reached him, he removed it. I met the full stare of eyes, darkly liquid and suffering with a black horror. "For God's sake," he whispered, "brush them off." I looked at him blankly. His eyes were fastened on some point in the air between us. He knew I was near, but apparently did not see me. "Brush what off?" "Quick," he moaned in a voice which had become husky and frantic. "I can't do a thing. They won't obey me." I stood motionless, too dumbfounded for thought. His eyes had taken on an aspect of utter terror, such as I had never believed possible in any human being. "My God!" he moaned in a low voice. He was silent for a moment. Then he caught his breath suddenly and gasped, and the gasp turned to a rising moan, the moan to one continuous, terrible shriek. He clawed at his face. He whipped the air all around, taking short steps in every direction, but stopping immediately, as if he hit something. His face was hellish and working convulsively. His hands now covered his head, now lashed about, and that fearful scream never ceased. He paused, and his voice became steadier. After a few seconds, he continued. "Well, I got a basin of water, carried it back in a trice, and hurled it in his face. Why I did, I don't know, except that I had no physical strength compared with that then in him. But at the first shock of the cold water, he stood still and his face changed. A puzzled look came into it. He abruptly became himself and sank exhausted into a chair. "Thanks," he said with a faint, ghastly smile. "My nerves are worse than I thought. I believe I shall take your advice." I come now to the last stage of that strange affair. That it may explain all is possible. That it will, I am not so sure. Perhaps Arthur Marle was insane, with a latent malady that had always afflicted him, or a sudden attack. But I saw the manuscript, and perhaps... It was getting dark when I left the club, but I decided to go to Arthur's residence at once and hailed a cab. I thought over what I had heard as I was carried toward his home, but I could make little of it. The one thing I was sure of was that the manuscript had something to do with the matter. We drew up to his house, and I dismissed the cab. It was quite dark by now. A light was burning in the house, but although I pushed the bell button, I could not hear it ring, and no one answered. Then I remembered that this was the servants' night off. I decided to presume on our friendship as I'd done many times before, and hence opened the door myself. Since Arthur was usually in his library at this time, I wasted no more time, but immediately went toward it. A dim light was burning there, but I could see no one. However, I turned the light on full before leaving in order to make sure, and on the floor lay Arthur Marle, long dead, his face set in a look of the most unutterable horror I have ever seen. His hands were extended, and his entire body seemed to be thrusting something away. Scattered near him were several small leaves of writing, which I glanced at briefly and stuffed into my pocket. It was not until an hour later that I got a chance to read them. I did what I could for Arthur, and made arrangements for proper treatment of the body. Once at my rooms, however, I hesitated no longer. I settled myself in a chair and spread out the leaves. They were mixed up, but even when I had arranged them, they did not form a complete record. For the first pages and some of the later were missing. And there, before the drowsy warmth of the fire, the room behind me darkened save for its dull glow, I read the leaves. "And so there was a country of the mad long ago. That first illusion, then, was true, and the author was right. 7. I have now translated the rest of the ancient volume, and part of the history of that strange land lies before me. Was there ever a myth wilder than the tale of the country of the mad? Think of it. More than 10,000 years ago, that band of madmen was collected and carried to a secluded mountain valley, and the only entrance sealed behind them. Guards were placed around the valley at first, But the years passed, the story became legendary, and the guards were withdrawn for wars and never returned. The legend itself faded in time, and the country of the mad, far beyond the known ranges, lay forgotten. But in all the years that the valley had been sealed, the band had survived and increased. At first they found it difficult to exist, for they were all insane and could not unite. But the valley was fertile, and they found it easy to live on the wild fruits and vegetables there, and the various small animals that were in it. They were people of all stages of insanity, and of several races. For a while they were antagonistic to each other, race to race, and individual to individual. Their twisted minds could not work together. None could tell what the madness of another might lead him to do. Murder, fighting, plot and counterplot, outbursts that sent them raging up and down the valley, were common at first. But years passed, and the young grew up accustomed to each other's madness. The children were almost invariably insane from birth. Normal ones were killed because they were not like the rest. The races themselves intermarried. And so, in time, their madness became equalized, their insanity a thing which affected all alike. The country of the mad flourished, a nightmare of nightmares, and it flourished not because of the madmen, but because of what had entered. The volume tells no more. What entered, therefore, remains a mystery, but I can guess. 12. Received a letter from Chelton saying he has acquired an ancient manuscript for me, and is forwarding it. He said it is written in a dead Indian tongue. Hope it refers to the country of the mad. 25. The manuscript has arrived, and I am beginning the translation. It is priceless, a chronicle from the valley itself written by one of the band. It seems to be the key to some rite. 29. John has left. I may never finish the translation. They are beyond my control already, wild from their enforced absence of nearly 10,000 years. God, I can't live without sleep, and I was fool enough to search for the most horrible tale. August 1st. I have destroyed the manuscript in my translation. If only I had never seen the thing, for I know now what it is that comes to him who has opened the door that they discovered. It is 3 days since I have closed my eyes. I have not slept since the night, and drugs won't keep me awake longer. 11 p.m. These may be the last words I shall write. I can hardly keep my eyes open, though I seem to feel them gathering. Insane, that are insane. No shape save the shape of nightmare and horror and rottenness. Shapes of corpses and staring skulls. Shapes indescribable. Shapes. I can't hold out any longer. I must sleep. I tell you, I must. What if they do come again? I tell you, I've got to sleep. Ah! My God, they're coming. They're crawling up my legs. They're creeping up my face, my eyes. God save me. And entering my brain.
This is Chris Bonner's tale, not mine. Please remember that. I positively will not stand sponsor for it. I used to have a deal of faith in Chris Bonner's veracity, but that is a thing of the past. He is a liar without conscience. I as good as told him so to his face. I wonder what kind of fool he thinks I am. Attend now, and you shall hear that remarkable tale he told me. It was, and is, a lie. I shall always think so. He came marching into my igloo up there at Aurora Bay. That is in Alaska, no, on the Arctic Sea. I had in the back country trading for pelts for a New York concern, and due to bad luck I didn't reach the coast until the 3rd day after the last steamer out had gone. And there I was marooned for the winter without chance of getting out until spring, with a few dozen ignorant Indians for companions. Thank heaven I had plenty of white man's grub in tins. As I said, here came Chris Bonner marching in on me the same as you would go down the block a few doors to call on a neighbor. "And where the devil did you drop in from?" I demanded, helping him off with a stiff parka. "Down there," he answered, jerking an elbow toward the south. Let's have something to eat, McNeil. I'm hungry as hell. Look at the pack, will you? I had already looked at the pack he had cast off his shoulders to the fur-covered floor of the igloo. It was as lean as a starved hound. I heated a can of beef bouillon and some beans and made a pot of coffee over the blubber-fat fire that served for both heat and light, and put these and some crackers before my guest. He tore into his meal wolfishly. "Now, a pipe and some tobacco, McNeil," he ordered, pushing the empty dishes aside. I gave him one of my pipes and my tobacco pouch. He filled and lighted up. He seemed to relish the smoke. I imagine he hadn't had one for some time. He sat silent for a while staring into the flickering flame. "Say, McNeil," he spoke at length, "what do you know about a theory that says once on a time this old world of ours revolved on its axis in a different plane? I've heard it said the earth tipped up about 70 degrees. What do you know about it?" That was a queer thing for Chris Bonner to ask. He was Simon Pure Prospector, and I had never known him to get far away from the subject of mining and prospecting. He had been hunting gold from Panama to the Arctic Circle for the past 30 years. "No more than you do, probably," I answered his question. "I've heard of that theory too. I'd say it is any man's guess. This theory holds that the North Pole used to be where the equator is now," he said. "Do you believe that?" "I don't know anything about it, Chris," I replied. "But I do know that they had found things up this way that are now generally recognized as being peculiarly tropical in nature." "What, for instance?" "Palms and ferns, a species of parrot, saber-toothed tigers, and also mastodons, members of the elephant family. All fossils and parts of skeletons, you understand?" "No human beings, McNeil? Any skeletons or fossils of those up this way?" "Never heard of it. Prehistoric people are being found in England and France, however." "Huh," he said. He pondered, puffing at his pipe, his eyes on the fire. He looked perplexed about something. "Look here, McNeil," he said suddenly. "Say a man dies. He's dead, ain't he?" "No doubt of it," I laughed, wondering. "Couldn't come to life again, eh?" "Hardly. Not if he were really dead. I've heard of cases of suspended animation. The heart apparently quits beating for 1, 2, or possibly 10 minutes. It doesn't, in fact, though. It's simply that its beating can't be detected. When a man's heart stops beating, he's dead." Bonner nodded. "Suspended animation," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "That must be it. That's the only thing that'll explain it. Nothing else will. If it could cover a period of 10 minutes, why not a period of 20, or even 100,000 years? If you'd like to turn in and get some rest, Chris, I'll fix you up," I broke in. He caught the significance of my tone and grinned. "You think I'm crazy, eh?" he said. "I'm not. It's a wonder, though, considering what I've seen and what I've... Here, let me show you something." He thrust a hand into his lean pack and brought forth an object that at first glance I thought to be a butcher's knife. He handed it to me, and I at once saw that it was not a butcher's knife as I knew such knives. It was a curious sort of knife, and one for which a collector of the antique would have paid a good money. It was a very dark color, almost black, corroded, it seemed to me, as if it had lain for a long time in a damp cellar. It was in one piece, the handle about 5 inches long and the blade perhaps 10 inches. Both edges of the blade were sharp and the end was pointed like a dagger. And it certainly wasn't steel. I scratched one side of the blade with my thumbnail and exposed a creamy yellow under the veneer of black. "Part of that's blood you scraped away, McNeil," Bonner said. "Now, what's that knife made of?" I examined the yellow spot closely. The knife was made of ivory. Not the kind of ivory I was acquainted with, however. It was a very much coarser grain than any ivory I had ever seen. "That came out of a mastodon's tusk, McNeil," Bonner said. I looked at him. He was nodding seriously. He apparently believed what he said at any rate. "Nice curio, Chris," I commented, handing the thing back to him. "Heirloom, no doubt. Picked it up in one of the Indian villages, eh?" He did not speak at once. He sat puffing, looking at the fire. Once he puckered his brows in a deep frown, waited. "I've been prospecting as usual," he said at length. "Down there, around the headquarters of the Tukuvuk. It's an awful place. Nobody ever goes there. The Indians tell me the spirits of the dead live there. I can believe it. It's an ideal place for imps and devils. And I was right through the heart of it. I believe I'm the first. No matter how I got there. I came up from the south last summer. You see, I had an idea there was gold in the country. The place where I finally settled down was in a little valley on one of the branches of the Tukuvuk between two ranges of hills, running from 500 to maybe 3,000 feet high. Messy-looking place it was, all littered up, as if the Lord had a few sizable chunks of stuff left over and just threw them down there to be out of the way. But the gold was there. I could almost smell it. I'd been getting some mighty nice color in my pan. That's what made me decide to stay there. I got it there about the middle of July and spent the rest of the summer sinking holes in the edge of the creek and along the benches above. What I found indicated that there was a mighty rich vein of the yellow metal thereabouts, with one end of it laying in a pocket of the stuff. If I could locate that pocket, I thought, I'd have the United States Treasury backed off the map. But I wasn't able to run the pocket down by taking bearings from my holes, because the holes didn't line up in any particular direction. What with my interest in trying to get a line on that pocket, I didn't notice that the season was getting late, but I'd brought in enough grub to last the winter through, so that didn't matter. Just the same, it was up to me to get some sort of shelter over my head. So I hustled up a one-room shack about 12 by 12 I cut from the timber on the slopes with my hand axe. Nothing fancy, but tight enough. I put in a fireplace and cut and stacked a lot of wood outside. That done, winter was on me. I simply couldn't resist the temptation to have one more try at finding the pocket that spewed the yellow metal all around there. As I said, I got no information from the holes sunk, and it was pure guesswork. I guessed I'd find my pocket on the side of a certain hill, about 200 feet above the creek level. A glacier followed down the side of that hill through a little gully, and my idea was that the ice ground away at the pocket and brought the metal down to the creek, and the creek scattered it. This theory was borne out to some extent by the fact that my best showings of color always came from a point a little below the conjunction of the creek and the glacier. It was snowing the morning I took my pan and shovel and started up the side of the hill, keeping to the edge of the glacier. It wasn't much of a glacier for size, say about 15 feet wide. I could see it winding up the side of the hill until it went out of sight through a cleft about 1,000 feet up, fed by a lake up there probably. I had climbed the hill maybe 100 feet, following the edge of the glacier, when I caught sight of a dark blotch in the edge of the ice. It was about 2 feet under the surface. I brushed away the film of snow to have a look. The ice was as clear as crystal, of a blue color. And what do you know, McNeil? It was a man's body. He paused and gave me a quick glance. He wanted to see how I took that, I presume. The body of a man, he went on, and the queerest looking man I ever saw in my life. He was lying on his belly, and I didn't get a look at the front of him just then, but I knew it was a man all right. He was covered all over with long hair, like a bear, say. Not a stitch of clothes. What did you do? I asked. Why, I was that surprised I let my pan and shovel drop and stared at the damn thing with the eyes near popping out of my head. What would anybody do finding a hair-covered thing like that frozen in a glacier? I won't deny I was a bit scared, McNeil. Well, I stood there staring at the thing for I don't know how long. It didn't occur to me then to ask myself how the thing got there. Certainly the idea of fossils or prehistoric men didn't enter my head. I didn't think much about anything. I just stood there gaping. You know me, McNeil. I guess I'm pretty soft-hearted in some respects. I'd stop to bury a dead dog I found on the road. I knew I wouldn't rest easy until I'd cut that thing out of the glacier and given it decent burial. Moreover, I didn't want it where I'd be seeing it when I went to work on the hillside in the spring. And it would surely be there in the spring because I imagined that glacier didn't move an inch a year. So I went back to the shack and got my axe, and with none too good a heart for the job, turned to and made the chips fly. It took me about 3 hours to get the thing out of the glacier. You see, as I came down to it, I went slow. I don't care to hack even a dead man. Say, McNeil, Can you imagine what it meant to me, digging a corpse out of the glacier, down there on the side of a hill in that devil-ridden country? No, you can't, and that's the truth. You have to go through it to know. It was hell. I don't want any more of it in mine, nor what followed either. What was that? I asked when he deliberated. You'll hear, he answered and went on. I got the thing out at last, little chunks of ice clinging to it, and dragged it ashore, if a glacier was ashore. It froze me to look at the thing with those little chunks of ice sticking to the long hair. Once, at Dawson, I'd seen a man pulled out of the Yukon, ice clinging to him. That was different, though. At Dawson, there was a crowd to sort of buck a man up. I turned the thing over on its back to see what it looked like in front. Well, said I. You have seen apes, McNeil? This thing looked like that? I countered, beginning to connect up his first queer question with what he was telling me. You don't mean it, Chris. I'm telling you, he nodded solemnly. An ape man, that's what it was. More man than ape, if you ask me. For instance, the face was flatter than an ape's, and the forehead and chin were more pronounced. The nose was flat, but it wasn't an ape's nose. And the hands and feet were like those of a man. Oh, it was a man all right. The thing that convinced me, I think, was a knife gripped in its hand. The knife you have there? I inquired. The very knife, he answered. What then, Chris? I urged him to go on. I had a good look at the thing and started for my shack. Yes, McNeil, I ran. And I'm not ashamed to say so. It scared me. Ugliest thing I ever saw. Eyes wide open, glaring and glinting, and the thick lips parted to show the nastiest set of fangs I ever saw in the mouth of a man or beast. Why, I tell you, the damn thing looked alive. No wonder I scooted. You would have done the same. Anybody would. Back in the shack, I sat down on my bunk to think it over. And it was while I sat there trying to puzzle it out that I remembered that theory about the earth tipping over. That gave me a hint of what I had run up against. Of course, I had heard about fossils and parts of the skeletons of prehistoric men being found. Had I found not a fossil or part of a skeleton, but the prehistoric man himself? That knocked the wind out of me. If that were the case, my name would go down in history, and I would be asked to give lectures before scientific societies and such. Consider it, McNeil. I tell you, I couldn't quite grasp the thing. It was incredible. There I was in this year of our Lord, with the intact corpse of a man who had lived God only knows how many centuries ago. That body, understand, could well be the key to the mystery of the origin of mankind. It might possibly settle the Darwinian theory forever, one way or the other. It was a pretty serious business for me, don't you see? Well, I decided to preserve the thing until I could get out and make a report of the find. But how to preserve it? Of course, if I had left it in the glacier, it would have kept indefinitely, like a side of beef in cold storage. I was afraid to put it back in the hole in the glacier and freeze it in again with water I carried from the creek. The creek water might exert some chemical action that would ruin the thing. And if I let it lay where it was, the snow would cover it, form a warm blanket, and probably cause it to decompose. Then I'd have nothing left but the skeleton. I wanted to save the thing just as I had found it. Maybe the scientist would find a way to embalm it. I finally hit on the plan of keeping it in an ice pack. That would turn the trick until the weather took on the job. It hadn't turned bitter cold yet, I tell you. It was a nasty job keeping that thing iced with chunks I chopped from the glacier. And to make it worse, the weather stayed moderate for a couple of weeks. Then suddenly the mercury in my little thermometer went down with a rush, and it got stinging cold. I carried the thing to the shack and stood it up against the wall outside where it couldn't be covered with snow, and lashed it there. Can you imagine me going to sleep in my bunk in the shack every night after that with that thing standing against the wall outside, not 2 feet away? Of course you can't. It frazzled my nerves, and more than once I was tempted to cut a hole in the ice on the creek and chuck the damn thing in where I'd never see it again. But no, I had to save it for the scientist and get my name in history. That idea got an obsession with me. I knew well enough that if I ever told people the tale I'm telling you now without some proof of it, I'd get laughed at. No doubt of it, I sneered. The days went by, he continued, ignoring my sneer, and more that thing outside kept getting on my nerves. The sun went south, and from one day to another I never saw it. The never-ending night was bad enough, but when you add the northern lights and the howling of the wolves, you've got a condition that breaks a man if he is not careful. Furthermore, there was that ugly-looking devil outside to think about. I was thinking about that thing constantly, and so I couldn't sleep. If I shut my eyes, I'd see it anyhow, and if I went to sleep, I'd have a nightmare over it. Now and then I'd go out and stand there in the starlight or the aurora looking at it. It fascinated me, yet the sight of the thing gave me the creeps. Finally, I began taking a club or my rifle along when I went to look at it. Got afraid the thing would come alive and try to murder me with that knife. And that's the way of things for maybe 3 months and more. My thoughts all the time on that thing outside. Well, that couldn't go on, you know. One morning I woke up with the worst headache a man ever had. I thought my head would split wide open. My blood was like molten iron flowing through my veins. I knew what it was. Fever. I had thought and worried about the thing outside until it got me, and I was in for a brainstorm. I was as weak as a cat, but managed to build up a good fire and pack my bunk with all the blankets and furs I had and crawl in. I only hoped I wouldn't freeze to death when the fire went out. I no sooner got all set in the bunk than things let go. I went completely off. I can't say positively what happened for a few days after that. Seems like I remember, though, periods when I was semi-rational. I think once I got up to put more wood on the fire. Another time I saw that thing standing in the doorway grinning at me like the devil it was. I shot at it with my rifle and later found a bullet in the door. My shooting couldn't have been a delusion at any rate. But the door was still fastened against the wolves and there were no tracks on the snow outside. Bonner paused to light his pipe and then went on. I don't know exactly how long I was out of my head. I had wound my watch before I crawled into the bunk for the first time, and I half remembered I wound it again when I got up to put wood on the fire. And it was pretty well run down. It goes 40 yards without winding. Yet when my head cleared, it had stopped. I must have been off my nut about 4 days. Well, you can bet your bottom dollar I'd had enough of the prehistoric men hanging around the shack by that time. Let the scientists be damned. I was determined to get rid of that thing the quickest way possible. The quickest way, I thought, would be to get the corpse warm so it would decompose rapidly. Then I'd put it outside where the wolves and ravens would pick the bones clean. The scientists would have to be satisfied with the skeleton. So I made a big fire in the fireplace and got the shack good and hot, then went out and brought in the corpse. I got sick at the stomach on that job, but it was the only way. I didn't have the heart to leave the thing outside and build a fire over it out there. I try to respect the dead, even if the corpse is that of a man who had been dead several thousand years and looked more like an animal than a human being. I laid the thing on the door before the fireplace, then sat down on the bunk to wait. I watched it pretty close, because being dead so long, I thought when it got warm and started to decompose, it would go like butter. I didn't want the shack to be all smelled up with the stink of it. Probably half an hour went by. Then all of a sudden, I saw the thing quiver. Your brainstorm returning, I interposed. Wait, said Bonner sharply. It quivered. Not much, but enough to notice. That sort of caught me. Then I reasoned that anything thawing out like that would naturally quiver a little. Maybe another 15 or 20 minutes passed. Then one of the legs moved. Jerked, sort of. It startled me. Remember, there I was, down there in those hills alone with that thing. I was pretty susceptible to weird influences, understand? Anyhow, the leg moved, and it sat up and asked for a drink of water. I could not help putting in. Bonner continued, paying no attention to my sarcasm. He seemed to be talking aloud to himself. I watched it like a hawk for some time after that. Then, as I didn't see it move any more, I stepped outside to get some more wood for the fire and to pull a few good breaths of cold air into my lungs. That shack was like the inside of an oven. When I went in again, I saw the damn thing had turned over on its back. Turned over on its back, I say. And there was a change in the eyes, too. They had a half-awake sort of look in them. A more alive look, understand. And breathing. Yes, sir, breathing. Why the thing didn't see me when I came in and shut the door, I don't know. But apparently it didn't. And believe me or not, the hand that held the knife was open and the knife was lying on the floor apart from the body. Crazy? I tell you, no. I was as sane as I am now. I tell you, I saw these things with my own two eyes. Saw them just as plain as I see you now. I see you don't believe me, McNeil. Oh, well, I don't blame you. I hardly believe it myself sometimes. He uttered a little laugh. But there it was, just as I am telling you. And I was that gone when I saw that the thing had turned over on its back that I dropped the wood I had in my arm. The crash of it on the floor brought the thing to its feet on the jump. You needn't look at me like that. I tell you it did. I take my oath it did. There it was, crouched like a panther, readied for the spring, the eyes of it flashing like fire, its lips pulled back tight across the gums and the yellow fangs showing. Can you see that? No, you can't. Bonner made an expressive gesture with one hand. Remarkable. But the thing hadn't seen me yet. It was looking at the fire. It was half turned toward me so I could see that. Suddenly it screamed in an outlandish gibberish and leaped to the fireplace and tried to gather in an armful of flames. I take it the thing had never seen fire before, didn't know what it was, probably imagined it some kind of wild animal. Naturally, the only thing it got out of that play was burnt arms and hands, and the long hair sizzled and curled. It leaped back with a snarl, spitting that funny gibberish. Talk, I guess it was. It came from way down in the belly and sounded like pigs grunting. I tell you, McNeil, I was fair dead, but I had the sense left to try to help myself. My rifle was leaning against the bunk, and I made a quick dive for it. Then apparently the thing saw me for the first time. The way it glared at me with those glittering eyes was a caution. I didn't stop to argue. I snatched up the rifle, cocked it, and made a snapshot. The bullet caught the thing in the left breast, and the blood gushed. Of course you don't believe it. But blood, I tell you, gushed from the breast of a thing that had been frozen in a glacier for thousands of years. Well, here it came like a cyclone. I didn't have time to shoot again. Smell? That thing smelled like carrion. Almost strangled me. Maybe you know how the cage of a wild animal stings if it ain't cleaned out for a week or two. This thing smelled like that, only worse. I can smell it yet. Lord. Warner wrinkled his nose and shivered. But there we were at grips, the thing making those smelly noises and smellings like 1,000 garbage piles. It had the strength of 10 men, I sensed that. It jerked the rifle from me and bent the barrel of it double with a twist of the wrist. The barrel of a .38 caliber Winchester rifle, bent it as easy as you or I would bend a piece of copper wire. Then we were at it, fighting like a couple of wildcats all over the shack. I'm no slouch of a man myself, McNeil, when it comes to rough and tumble, but that thing handled me like a baby. I could see my finish. We threshed about the floor, me fighting like a devil, it fighting like 40 devils. We kicked into the fire and out again and scattered live coals all over the place, and the shack took fire. I was just about gone when my hand accidentally fell on the handle of the knife the thing had dropped on the floor. I hung on to it and poked away at that thing for all I was worth, driving the blade clean up to the hilt with every punch. That knife? I broke in. This knife, answered Bonner. There's a dried blood on it yet, but I think it was really the bullet that did the work. It must have cut an artery. Anyhow, the blood kept gushing out of the thing's breast. It got on my hands and made them slippery. I knew the thing couldn't pour out blood like that and keep going. That's what put the heart in me to keep on fighting. And as I say, I think it was a bullet that did the work in the long run. A lucky shot, otherwise I wouldn't be here now. I felt the thing sagging and going limp in my hands, and its grip began to relax. I saw my chance and put up a knee and broke the grip and kicked it away. It staggered around a moment or two, clutching its breast with its bloody paws, gnashing its fangs and glaring murder at me. Then it crashed down on the floor and fell smack into the flames. I saw plain enough there was no chance of saving the shack, so I snatched up what I could lay my hands on in the way of food and clothing and blankets and tore out. I don't remember putting the knife in my pocket, but that's where I found it later. The shack burned down to nothing, and that thing burned with it. Probably not a bone of it left. The scientists were out of luck, and the mystery of mankind would remain unsolved. I didn't stop to investigate, of course. My job was to make tracks. I knew about this village and came on. How I got here, I don't know. This is a terrible country to cross afoot in the winter. I turned my 10 huskies adrift to shift for themselves. When I reached the valley where all this happened, I didn't have the grub to keep them going. I had to walk here. And that's all, McNeil. You can say what you please. I know what I saw with my own eyes, and you can't change my mind about it. Suspended animation? Yes, for a period of covering many centuries. It would be a mighty fine thing if we could picture what happened away back there when this old earth tipped over. Perhaps we'd see a man that was half ape, crossing a creek with a knife in his hand on the way to murder an enemy sleeping on the opposite bank. Then suddenly the earth tipped over. Climatic conditions in those days were such as to freeze things up in a flash. Things are held in the grip of the ice just as the dust and lava held them up in the days of Pompeii. And, well, who's to say what happened? Anything was possible. We don't know the conditions of those days. Anyhow, here I come thousands of years later and dig a man with a knife in his hand out of a glacier. I heat his body in order to decompose the flesh. Instead of decomposing, he comes to life and I have to kill him. He's been hibernating in a glacier for centuries. I don't know what to think about it. Bonner refilled and lighted his pipe, then looked at me questioningly. Chris, I said, I tell you frankly that I don't believe a word you have said. You tell me you were out of your head for a few days. That accounts for it. You had the Jim Jams and imagined all that. Then try to spring it on me as actual fact. He looked hurt. He looked at the knife in his hand steadily for several long moments, then thrust it toward me, his eyes boring into mine. Then where in the hell, he demanded, did I get this knife? The Living Nightmare by Anton M. Oliver. You mean to tell me, demanded Jim Brown, that those people left town and expect you to stay in that house alone tonight? Why, yes, said Macmillan, preparing to leave. They've gone to Virginia and will be back Thursday, when the funeral will take place. And they left the body lying in the living room? Of course. Where did you expect them to leave? On the porch? Are you going to sleep in that house alone, with the corpse? Yes. What of it? There's nothing to be afraid of. Taking his hat and coat, Macmillan departed. Pleasant dreams, called Brown as the door slammed behind him. The night was cold and the atmosphere was clear and hot. The snow crackled under his feet as he walked. Silly idea, he muttered, but he couldn't help wondering why the Mitchells, with whom he made his home, had left the house on the same day that Mrs. Mitchell's grandmother had passed away. In his mind he went over Mrs. Mitchell's explanation. She had told him that they were going to Wheeling, the deceased lady's old home, where a sister lived, and would remain there until the funeral. And she had asked, "You're not afraid to stay here alone, are you?" No, of course, he was not afraid. But it was strange that they should leave the corpse in his charge and depart. Then it came to him. Funny he hadn't thought of it before. The Mitchells must be superstitious. They probably had some silly notion about a house being haunted while a corpse was in it, or something of that sort. That must be it. But how ridiculous! Still, the Mitchells were a little queer anyway, reflected Mac, as he turned up the ice-covered path of the Mitchell residence. It stood surrounded by high buildings and stores in a section of town which in days gone by had been the very heart of the city's social life. It was one of the largest and oldest homes in the city, and now it was an outcast, so to say, among the monuments to industry and progress. Built years ago by the husband of the woman who now lay dead within its walls, it was in a style of architecture long since abandoned. Everything about it was high and narrow. The building itself, the windows and doors, the porch columns, and the roof high up among the tree branches. Mac walked unhesitatingly towards the big dark house, but somehow the formidable brick walls that always looked so inviting seemed cold and inhospitable tonight. Strange shadows were playing in the windows. He looked up at his own window. He didn't exactly fancy the idea of going past the room where lay the dead woman, he admitted to himself, but he certainly was not afraid. Not he. With grim resolution he thrust the key which he had taken from his pocket while coming up the walk into the lock of the front door. The huge glass panel door squeaked as he did so, and he was almost startled by his own reflection in the shining glass. He turned the key in its lock and threw the door wide open with unnecessary vigor. A hot wave of air greeted him. The house was warm, surprisingly so, considering that it had been unoccupied all day. His heart, for some unexplainable reason, was beating rather fast as he entered the dark hall. He turned sharply to the left and reached for the electric light switch. His hand had often turned that switch, had often found it instantly in the dark, but tonight he had to feel for it. He turned it once, twice, 3 times, but the hall remained dark. The dark suddenly seemed to give him almost physical pain. Listening acutely, he tried to account for this. Why were the lights out? The street lights were on, and there was light in several of the houses he had passed. He stood motionless. There was no sound. The dark house was buried in death-like silence. Then, with nerve-shattering suddenness, came a sound as real as that of his heart, which was beating so that the blood was throbbing in his ears. He whirled to face it, but as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. With clenched teeth and damp forehead, Max stood motionless. Then it came again, a sound like the distant scream of a siren. Gradually he collected his senses, and reason took the place of bewilderment. He reached for his matches, and striking one, he stepped over to the gas chandelier, turned the valve, and presently a blue flame leaped high from the lamp, which had not been adjusted for months. With somewhat trembling hands he turned the air adjustment, then the gas, until finally the familiar yellow light illuminated the hallway. Then he again heard the noise, this time a little louder and nearer. His decision to investigate suddenly left him. He stood motionless, unable to move, for he not only heard, he also felt. Then, with a sudden resolve, he stepped swiftly to his room, which was on the same floor and adjoined the library. The light from the hall cast a long, distorted shadow on the floor before him. It was so still now that the silence surged in his ears. Lighting his own gas lamp, he locked and bolted his door. His pipe lay on the dresser, and he lit it nervously. Then he looked at himself in the mirror. "How ridiculous," he said, half aloud, with a forced laugh. Then he began slowly to undress. All was quiet and peaceful here in his own room. How foolish to let himself get so excited. The lights had probably gone out all over the city since he had entered the house, and as for that noise, it was probably outdoors somewhere, and in his mind he had associated with the perfectly harmless corpse lying in the next room. "Darn Brown," he murmured. "He got me all wrought up over nothing with his kidding." And having finished undressing, he retired, leaving his light on full, however. In spite of the fact that his own explanation of the origin of the strange sounds had, in a measure, satisfied him, he lay awake for a considerable length of time. He was drifting off on the first soft currents of sleep when he suddenly sat up with a jerk. He had heard a noise. His lamp was flickering weirdly, and he could hear its faint singing, barely audible, yet it seemed to his ears like the mighty rush of steam from a boiler, for his ears were strained to hear a different sound, a sound he must hear again, the source of which he must locate. His body began to ache from sitting rigidly in one position. Still all was silent. Suddenly, with a sense of being jerked to consciousness, he again heard the noise, like the shriek of a siren. It seemed distant, yet close. His heart labored so hard that he could feel its beat all through his body. The shriek continued for several moments, and then all was silent again. He wanted to rise, but he could not. He was not afraid, he told himself, and yet... Suddenly he heard the sound of footsteps, steps that seemed to come from the interior of the wall, pass through his room and die away gradually. Holding his breath, he listened. The big clock in the front room struck the hour of midnight. He counted each beat as it rang through the house. He was wide awake now. The white curtains seemed to glimmer like sunlit snow, and the clock chimes, in the deathly silence, sounded like those of a mighty tower clock. As the last note died away, Mac suddenly remembered that the clock had been stopped by Mrs. Mitchell as a mark of respect to her, who in the adjoining room was awaiting burial. A sudden feeling of relief came over Mac. It was clear now. Somebody had come back. Mr. Mitchell, perhaps. That explained everything. Confidently, Mac got out of bed and, unlocking his door, stepped into the hall. How different everything looked, how natural and homelike. The light that had had such a ghost-like appearance a short time ago seemed friendly and quite natural now. At the foot of the stair, Mac stopped and called. He called louder and louder, but all remained silent. Suddenly, for some inexplicable reason, he approached the door of the room next to his, seized the doorknob resolutely, and with a sudden push swung the door open. The rays of the gaslight in the hall fell directly into the room, and what they revealed sent a cold shudder of horror through him. Before him stood two empty pedestals. The body had disappeared. Turning violently, he almost ran to the front door and pulled it open. An icy gust of wind hit his thinly clad body. For several moments he stood breathing the cold night air. Then, with a sudden determination, he slammed the big oak door shut. As the door slammed, there came a sharp report like the snapping of a wire, followed by a thunder and crashing and wailing. The electric light came on, and the same footsteps that had sounded through the house before came closer and closer. He felt a sharp pain like the thrust of a knife between his shoulder blades, and then he fell in a swoon. Weeks passed before Mac was well again. Excessive exposure had brought on pneumonia. As soon as he recovered, he summoned me to the hospital and begged me to find a new lodging for him and remove his belongings from the Mitchell home. I tried in vain to explain that he had misunderstood Mrs. Mitchell regarding the disposal of the corpse, for they had taken the body with them for burial in Wheeling, and it was not in the house at any time after their departure. But Mac was resolute. He listened indulgently, patiently, then, laying his white, hot hand upon my shoulder, he looked earnestly into my eyes, and with a voice that carried conviction, he said, "I know what I felt in that room that night. It had a hold on me, and it is waiting for me, and I am not going back." Mac is well again now, and one can see him at the club most any night. But whenever anybody starts to speak of the hereafter, he rises and hurriedly leaves the room.
A brief ghost story is The House on the Highway by August Derleth. Well, I guess we're here to stay. Where are we? Somewhere in Wisconsin, between Madison and Sauk City, wherever that is. How far? About halfway, I take it. There's a hill marked on the map, Springfield Hill. That must be the place. Yes, Highway 12, Springfield Hill. I wonder if we could phone in somewhere. There doesn't seem to be a house in sight. Yes, there's one. Deserted? Guess so. No, there's a light. A lamp. They haven't got a phone. No, I guess not. Well, what'll we do? It's pretty near midnight. I suppose we'll have to try to get bunks for the night. Just as you say, Doc. The man called Doc climbed out of the car. He stood there in the drizzling rain while his companion followed him out. We'd better push the car off to the side. All right. The two men picked their way carefully through the muddy ruts of the road to the rear of the machine. In a few moments, the car was safely placed to the side of the road. Then the men made for the house. It was very dark, and the light of a lamp threw a dim glow around the solitary window through which it shone. Presently they were knocking at the door. At first there was no answer. They had to repeat the knock a second time. Then an old man opened the door and shambled out to them, peering at them closely from under bushy white eyebrows. "Hello," said Doc. "We're sorry to have to disturb you this time of night, but our car's broken down. We'd like to know if we can bunk here tonight." The old man shaded his eyes and looked out toward the road. "Yes," he said, "I suppose you can." "We'll be glad to pay you for the accommodation." "Oh, don't mind that," the old man was saying as he led them into a large room upon which the front door opened. "I'm used to company at all hours. No trouble at all. Glad to have you." In the light, the travelers had a better view of their host. He appeared very old. The white hair on his head was straggly, but his beard was full. His cheeks were sunken, but in his eyes there was a feverish gleam. He coughed violently once or twice. "Consumption, last stages," Doc whispered to his companion. "Do you live alone?" he asked the old man in a louder voice. "Yes," he answered, "for 7 years now. That was when my daughter left me." "Ran away?" "No," he shook his head, "just left. Got married, I expect." "Oh," said Doc, somewhat disconcerted. His companion cleared his throat and looked around vacantly. "Ever come to see you?" "No, hasn't got time. She's too busy nowadays." "Don't you miss her?" "Sometimes. Not much. I'm pretty used to living alone now." The man called Doc glanced around the room. It was almost devoid of furniture. A dilapidated table and 2 or 3 very old chairs stood about. That was all. Through the half-open door, he looked into the next room. There he could see a low couch, evidently the old man's bed. "I expect you will want to sleep." The old man rose and threw open the door to the next room, pointing to the couch. "There you are, if you can use it. I'd like to sleep myself, but I have always got lots of company during the night." "Company?" "Yes, along about this time. My wife and my sister, they've both been dead going on 14 years now." Doc looked at his companions. "Hallucinations," he muttered in an undertone. The old man coughed into a handkerchief that he had suddenly produced from somewhere. "Then there's my parents. They always come to me about 2 o'clock. And my son, who died 10 years ago. He comes pretty regular." "Well," said Doc, "I guess we'll turn in now." "Go right ahead. I know how it is to be sleepy all night. And if we disturb you, just rap on the door." Alone in their room, the 2 men looked at each other a moment in strained silence. "Is he crazy or what?" "Mildly, I suppose," answered Doc. "Delusions and hallucinations are pretty common in people in the last stages of consumption. Paranormal hallucinatory, one might call it. Too bad about his daughter leaving him." "That was funny. Did you notice the way he talked about her? Didn't seem to hold anything against her." "He's a specimen. Doesn't even seem to know what became of her, and doesn't care. Got married, I expect," he said. "And getting company at night. At first it made me wonder, but then he began to talk about his dead wife and sister. I knew he was somewhat unbalanced." "Maybe he does get company. Neighbors dropping in on him just to humor him along." "Possibly, at any rate. Well, I'm going to sleep. It's none of my business." He went over to the couch and sat down on it. "Good Lord! This couch is damp." His companion went over to him. "No wonder he's got consumption. The whole place smells musty as a deuce. It'll just take him a couple of months sooner, that's all." It was almost dawn when Doc woke up. He stretched himself and nudged his companion. "I'm awake, Doc. Have been since 2 o'clock." "What's the matter? Place too damp?" "No, I was trying to hear what the old man and his visitors were talking about." "Visitors?" "Yes, he had all of a dozen or more. Neighbors or not, I don't know. They were all old codgers like himself. I looked out on them once. They're gone now, and the old man with them. All night they were talking and mumbling in some godforsaken language. I couldn't get a word." Doc began to laugh. "That's the best ever. I can just see you losing sleep just to hear what the old fellow was talking about. Well, it's true, believe it or not." The old man was not in the room when they emerged from their damp chamber. Somehow, everything seemed older than it had looked in the light of the lamp. At sight of a patch of sunlight on the floor, Doc began to whistle. Though they looked, they could not find the old man. They left at last to find some place from which to telephone to the nearest town. From the road they looked back at the house. It was very ramshackle, much more so than they had thought, and had all the marks of a deserted house. Somewhat off to the side, Doc noticed a for sale sign. Half an hour later they came upon a farmhouse on the northern slope of the hill. "Hello!" they called to the man in the yard. The farmer looked up. "Got a telephone we could use?" "Come in," called the farmer in return. "You go right up to the house," he continued, as the travelers came closer, "and my wife will show you where it is." "Our car broke down last night," said Doc affably, while his companion went on up to the house. "That so? You look as if you slept in a car." "Oh, we stayed at your neighbor's." "Which neighbor?" "The old man who lives down the road a piece. Old, white-haired fellow. He's pretty sick, it looks to me." The farmer looked at him intently. "You stayed at that place?" he said, at last, in an incredulous voice. "Yes, it's pretty damp, believe me, and musty. Ugh!" "Well, by God," the farmer was staring at him in frank disbelief. "By God, I never would have believed it." From out of the house came the farmer's wife and Doc's companion. "By God," said the farmer for the third time, and turned and saw his wife. "That's his daughter, stranger. But that old man died of consumption 7 years ago, come next week." The Story of a Lethal Curse. The Inheritors, by August W. Derleth. There is no longer any valid reason for withholding the true facts of the tragedy at Hudson Heights from the public, and I chronicle these facts now in response to the pressure of public opinion. The matter really began with Mommsen's note of the 7th, asking me down for the 17th, or before, if possible. Mommsen was an old chap, but always intensely interesting. Our mutual interest in archaeology had brought us together some years before. From the first, Mommsen had been interested in old houses. A mere interest had developed into a passion, and within a half-year preceding the note of the 7th, I heard from a mutual friend that he had finally acquired an old colonial mansion somewhere along the Hudson. He had named it, aptly enough, Hudson Heights. It was at this place that Mommsen met me at midday of the 17th. He was little changed except for the faint lines that appeared around his mouth and eyes. His hair, too, was graying at the temples. "I thought you weren't coming, old man. I'd about given up hope." He laughed as he took my suitcase, and again when I explained that I had been detained at the office. "I might have suspected that." He disappeared into another room with my belongings. When he returned, I began to question him. Could it be his birthday? I dare say I amused him, for he brushed my questions aside, explaining that he had called me down because he thought me the most reliable of all his acquaintances for the thing we were to go through. This was a point gained, and I urged him on. "You notice there's a striking lack of servants?" he asked. I nodded. I had noticed it and had intended to ask about it. In a house like this, and with the money that Mommsen made no secret of having, the absence of servants was inexcusable. Every year the servants take off on the 17th of this month. Prior to this year, even the owners of the place were out on that day. "Why?" I asked, in ill-conceived wonder. He shrugged his shoulders. "On the 17th of February, this place is turned over to the ghost, or ghosts, whichever it is. Only on this date is the house haunted." With this he rose, refused to answer my questions, and promised to take the matter up in detail at dinner that evening. Dusk was coming on when we seated ourselves at the table in the old dining room. Mommsen began his story without hesitation, though I noticed that he was vaguely disconcerted by the absence of the servants, for more than once his hand stole out toward a bell cord, as if to ring a bell in the servants' quarters. Beyond that, he was perfectly at ease. The whole thing started in 1792, on the night of the 17th of February. One Hendrik Van Dam, then owner of this place, much the same at that time as it is now, was fatally stabbed with a rapier while he was at the table. He was stabbed in the back, so the story goes, and did not know who stabbed him. Nor would anyone tell him, for I understand he was cordially hated. He cursed all in the house on that day in the double breath that remained to him before he died. A great many versions of the curse got about, of course, but everyone seemed to agree that the curse would pass off only when the oldest of 4 generations of the murderer's descendants had been killed. That much sounds as if it might have happened, doesn't it? I nodded. It struck me that I had read of the incident in some old history of New York, but as of the moment I found it impossible to trace my source. What follows doesn't sound so plausible. It seems that everyone in the house on the 17th died within a year. Quite naturally. However, I understand it was thought somewhat unusual that all those people should die before the following February. But coincidence is not ruled out. Some people put the whole aftermath down to coincidence, but most of the natives candidly profess the belief that the deaths had occurred through the diabolism of the dead Van Dam. After that, the place stood vacant for a good many years. In 1827, a well-to-do New Yorker took the place, remodeled it somewhat, and prepared to live in it. In the house, this man found a packet of letters that proved conclusively that Matilda Van Dam's lover had killed the old man. It had been prearranged, and on the basis of general hatred of old Van Dam, it was carried out without even the protest from his wife. At any rate, nothing remained to make anyone hesitate about living in the house. In 1828, on the first 17th of February that he was in the house, the new owner died. The doctor said that there had been some heart trouble, but it got around that there was a curious burnt mark on the man's breast. A year later, the man's son and heir died in precisely the same way. Then the family decamped, and, of course, the curse and its history were bruited about once more. On the strength of the letters found, an addition was made to the curse, that those who lived in the house before the time the curse had expired would inherit the curse and all its evil. But the real inheritors were to remain the oldest in each of the 4 successive generations of the murderer's line. At this point, too strong a coincidence to be disregarded enters into the story. You have been aware of my eccentricities, among them the peculiar and inexplicable dread that I undergo on the 17th of February. I recall that Mommsen had once said something, and said as much. He went on. Well, the letters found in 1827 give the name of the murderer as Mommsen, which is not entirely like mine, but similar enough to be taken as an old form of my name. That fact in itself means nothing, of course, but when you add to that the knowledge of my grandfather's sudden death after the birth of his only son, my father, and my father's tragic accident on the night of my birth, the coincidence begins to take a definite form. On top of it, I might add that we know absolutely nothing about our ancestry beyond my grandfather. It is entirely possible, you see, that the lover of Milady Van Dam was a lineal ancestor of mine, my great-grandfather, most probably. Right, I exclaimed. In that case, he went on without hesitation, he would have been the first of the inheritors, and I will be the fourth. I ridiculed the suggestion, and he freely accepted the ridicule. He considered the chance remote, and had only mentioned it as such. But to go back to the story of the house, he said at last, in 1872 it was again occupied. Since the region was saturated with the legends concerning the house, it was thought advisable to vacate it on the 17th of February. This was done regularly until 1877, when the head of the house excused the servants, but stayed in the building himself, together with his family. He was found dead in the morning of the 18th. The doctors again said, heart trouble, but no doctor could explain the burnt mark on the man's breast. After that, the house was faithfully vacated on successive 17ths of February. Thus, in time, the legend got about that old Henrik Van Dam returns on the night of February 17th to kill the head of the house. Psychic investigators say that the house is merely the abode of forces of evil, which manifest themselves on that particular night, and it is true that no one has ever seen a ghost here. It is my opinion that all of this is a vast coincidence. You and I are up here to prove the statement tonight, and I hope we'll do it. But there are several things that bother me, and one in particular. When I first got into this house, something happened that I've never quite forgotten. In a moment when my mind was wandering, I got up one day from the table and walked into a wall as if to pass through a door. Later, when I looked over old plans of the house, I found that there had originally been a door in that place, but that it had been sealed over in 1827. I said nothing, for I frankly did not know how to take the story. It was considerably outside my ken. You can imagine the reaction of a staid businessman in such a position. "Well," I said at last, "I'm willing to face the ghost if you are." He nodded and set about to clear the table. What happened after that I'm not certain. I know that Mommsen and I sat and drank his good liquor until both of us were feeling somewhat unnecessarily gay under the circumstances. It all started when Mommsen got up from the table and went to the door. He stuck his head out into the hall and came back to the table. "I say," he said, "do you smell anything?" "No," I answered, but even as I said it, a faint whiff of smoke came to my nostrils. "Sulphur, isn't it?" asked Mommsen. I agreed with him. "Got any in the house?" I asked. "None, and nothing that would smell like that, I'm sure. It must come from outside. Just notice how the drapes of the windows billow inward. Where'd that wind come from so suddenly?" Perhaps the liquor had made us both rather hazy. The lights seemed suddenly dim. Mommsen stood opposite me. His eyes were raised somewhat. They were fixed on the window opening on the terrace. I turned. There was nothing there, save the drapes which whipped to and fro in the wind. The atmosphere was heavy, with the odor of some obnoxious drug that seemed to deaden us. A swirl of fog seemed to fill one room. Mommsen raised an arm suddenly and pointed. "Look!" he screamed. "Look!" But I could see nothing. The air was cold with a ghastly chill, and from a distance came the sound of feet running. It was as if they were coming toward us with the wind that had suddenly arisen from some eldritch source, and was sweeping now through the old dining room. Then there sounded far away a cry, rising and falling, demonic, shrill, fraught with horror. At the same moment Mommsen's face twisted utterly. In the dim light that fell on him, he looked grisly. The shadows on his face stood out like great black holes in his white skin. Look! His voice whispered eerily. Look! He flung out his arms as if to ward off something. Then he fell flat on his face. At once, the eerie disturbance was stopped. The rushing, whistling wind was gone. The drapes at the windows swayed gently. There were no sounds of running feet, nor weird cries from the sky. The lights became brighter. For a moment I stood there, trying to recover myself. I remember that I reached for the decanter of liquor before I thought of Mumpson. Then I ran to him. The shock had been too much for him, I thought, and bent to pick him up. His hand was cold as ice. It needed no expert to tell that he was dead. I turned him over on his back. His eyes were wide and staring. His face was a picture of abject terror. But it was his breast that attracted my immediate attention. His dinner coat and vest were virtually burned away, so that his breast lay exposed. Just below the breastbone was a dark, brownish discoloration, as if a long-dead wound had burned itself to the surface. It looked for all the world as if the point of a rapier had come through from the back, leaving the flesh burned in this unholy manner. "The fourth inheritor," I murmured, half to myself. Even as I said it, there came a whirling breath of ice-cold air that struck me full in the face, passed, and was gone. I turned. The long drapes at the window were shuddering, but above the horror of it all, I felt a vast, brooding sense of peace.